Eleanor closed the app on her phone, staring blankly at the soft glow of her bedside lamp. No new message from Edward. Not that she particularly cared anymore. Something had shifted over the last few weeks, something she couldn't put her finger on. Where there was once an intoxicating thrill, a surge of adrenaline with every text or glance stolen across a dim-lit cafe, now there was, what? Routine? Predictability? Her affair with Edward had begun in a flurry of reckless passion almost a year ago. Both trapped in seemingly stagnant marriages, they had found a strange solace in one another. Eleanor had always been the composed one, poised, polished, and perfectly controlled. Yet with Edward, she had let herself unravel, shed the heavy burden of perfection, and indulge in a version of herself she hadn't recognized in years. The first few meetings had felt electric. Sneaking out of her suburban home under the guise of errands, Eleanor had raced to their secret rendezvous with a pounding heart and trembling hands. Edward was everything her husband, Daniel, wasn't: attentive, mysterious, uncharted territory. Their moments together were forbidden and therefore thrilling. But now, Eleanor sighed deeply, leaning back against the headboard. Now the texts came like clockwork, predictable and void of the spark that once left her breathless. Their weekly meetings, once drenched in anticipation and fiery passion, had become another routine to fit into her already packed schedule. Even the intimacy, while still technically good, left her with an emptiness she couldn't quite name. Why then did she stay? Why did she find herself still replying to his messages, still driving to meet him even though her heart no longer raced? There was something about Edward, something unspoken, perhaps even unresolved, that kept her tethered. The guilt she felt about her failing marriage was mirrored by the confusion she felt about ending this affair. She wasn't sure what she was holding on to anymore, him, or the person she had been with him. The following week, Eleanor found herself sitting across from Edward in their usual spot, a small corner booth in a cafe on the edge of town. He was as composed as ever, his features calm and unreadable, but she noticed how he avoided her eyes, the way his hands fidgeted ever so slightly. "Is something on your mind?" she asked, tilting her head. Edward hesitated for a moment before offering her a tight smile. "No, just work. Things have been hectic." Liar, Eleanor thought, though she didn't press. She had come to recognize the subtle tells in his otherwise impassive face, the ways he masked his thoughts and feelings. She had been drawn to that mystery once, the challenge of peeling back his layers. Now, she wondered if she had ever truly known him at all. The conversation meandered through safe, surface-level topics. The dreariness of corporate jobs, the monotony of suburban life. Eleanor found herself tuning out, her mind wandering to Daniel. He had been unusually attentive lately, bringing her coffee in bed and asking about her day in a way that felt almost earnest. She couldn't decide if it was comforting or unnerving. "Eleanor," Edward's voice cut through her thoughts, drawing her back to the present. "Sorry, I was just thinking about something," she said quickly, forcing a smile. He studied her for a moment, his dark eyes searching hers. "You've been distant lately." She blinked, caught off guard. "Have I?" "Yes," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. "Is something wrong?" For a moment, Eleanor considered telling him the truth, that she wasn't sure she felt the same way anymore, that the fire between them had dimmed. But as she looked at him, at the man who had once felt like an escape, she hesitated. Instead, she reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on his. "No," she said softly. "Everything's fine." But it wasn't. Eleanor's life outside of Edward was becoming increasingly complicated. Daniel had been acting strangely, hovering around her, asking questions he had never asked before. His sudden interest in her schedule made her wonder if he had begun to suspect something. But then, there was a tenderness in his actions that confused her. He had started leaving little notes for her on the kitchen counter. Simple things like, "Have a good day," or "You looked beautiful this morning." It was so unlike him that Eleanor didn't know how to respond. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, Daniel walked into the kitchen and leaned against the counter, watching her. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone casual but probing. Eleanor glanced at him, her heart skipping a beat. "Just tired, I guess. Work has been stressful." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "You know, if there's ever anything you want to talk about, I'm here." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Eleanor forced a smile and turned back to the stove, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred the pot of soup. She couldn't remember the last time Daniel had looked at her like that, with concern, with care. It made her feel both guilty and resentful. Later that night, as she lay in bed next to him, Eleanor found herself staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She thought about Edward, about the way he had seemed almost detached during their last meeting. She thought about Daniel, about the way he had been trying, in his own quiet way, to bridge the gap between them. And she thought about herself, about the woman she had become, torn between two lives that both felt increasingly hollow. It happened on a Tuesday. Eleanor had just returned from meeting Edward, her mind clouded with doubt and frustration. The meeting had been brief, awkward. He had been distant, his usual charm replaced by a cold aloofness that made her wonder if he, too, was losing interest. When she walked into the house, she found Daniel sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture that made her stomach churn. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and steady. "We need to talk." Her heart sank. "About what?" He gestured to the seat across from him, and she reluctantly sat down, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "I know," he said simply. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. "Know what?" "About him," Daniel said, his eyes boring into hers. "About Edward." The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in around her. For a moment, she couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. And then, as the shock began to fade, she realized something. She didn't feel the panic she had expected. Instead, she felt relief. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. "Long enough," he replied. "But I wanted to hear it from you." Eleanor looked at him, at the man she had once loved, the man she had betrayed. And for the first time in months, she felt the weight of her choices crash down around her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you." Daniel nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I believe that. But you did." The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of Eleanor's life. She and Daniel had long, painful conversations about their marriage, about the ways they had both failed each other. For the first time in years, they were honest, not just about the affair, but about everything. Edward, meanwhile, faded into the background. Their last conversation had been brief and unremarkable, a mutual acknowledgement that whatever they had shared was over. He had been a chapter in her life, but one that was now firmly closed. In the end, Eleanor and Daniel decided to try again. It wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. They rebuilt their relationship piece by piece, learning to see each other not as the people they had been, but as the people they were now. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt a sense of peace. She had made mistakes, big ones, but she had also learned from them. And as she sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she realized something. The butterflies might have been gone, but what she had now was something far more enduring. Months passed, and Eleanor and Daniel began to settle into their renewed relationship. On the surface, things were going well. They spent more time together, took weekend trips to the countryside, and even joined a couple's cooking class. These small changes felt like a fresh start, a bridge slowly being rebuilt. Eleanor found herself laughing with Daniel again, genuinely enjoying his company in a way she hadn't in years. But deep down, Eleanor couldn't shake the nagging voice in her head. Was it enough? Was this new, polished version of their marriage sustainable? Or was it just a temporary fix for something broken beyond repair? Daniel, for his part, seemed to be trying his hardest to move forward. He didn't bring up Edward or the affair, and he had been nothing but patient and supportive since their reckoning. Yet, Eleanor noticed the cracks. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she'd catch him staring at her with a distant expression, as though he were lost in thought or doubt. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Daniel's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He glanced at the screen and quickly turned it face down. Eleanor's stomach churned. She tried to ignore the sudden rush of paranoia, but the seed had been planted. What if he was hiding something? What if, despite their best efforts, the foundation of their marriage was still too unstable to hold? The irony wasn't lost on her. After everything that had happened, after the months of guilt and regret, Was she now the one questioning his loyalty? The question lingered in Eleanor's mind, growing heavier with each passing day. And then, one afternoon, she was forced to confront it. She had been running errands downtown when she saw him. Edward. He was sitting outside a cafe, a cup of coffee in hand, laughing with a woman she didn't recognize. Her first instinct was to walk past, to pretend she hadn't seen him. But something stopped her. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the unresolved tension that still lingered between them. Whatever the reason, she found herself walking up to the table. "Edward," she said, her voice steady but cold. He looked up, his smile faltering. "Eleanor, I didn't expect to see you here." The woman beside him glanced between them, sensing the tension. "I'll give you a moment," she said, standing and walking inside the cafe. Eleanor crossed her arms, staring down at Edward. "So this is what you're doing now? Charming someone else?" He shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "We've both moved on, haven't we? I assumed that's what you wanted." "What I wanted," Eleanor said, her voice sharp, was honesty. "Instead, you pulled away and left me to clean up the mess." Edward sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't pull away, Eleanor. You did. You stopped responding, stopped caring. What was I supposed to do? Wait around for scraps of your attention?" Eleanor opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. Was he right? Had she been the one to let their connection fade? The truth was murkier than she wanted to admit, and the realization left her feeling hollow. "Goodbye, Edward," she said finally, turning on her heel and walking away. As she made her way back to her car, she felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a strange sense of closure. Whatever she had shared with Edward, it was truly over now. And maybe that was for the best. That evening, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in her hand. She replayed the conversation with Edward in her mind, dissecting every word, every nuance. She had spent so long blaming him for the end of their affair, but now she wasn't so sure. She thought about Daniel, about the life they had rebuilt together. Was she holding on to it because she truly wanted it, or because it was the safe, familiar choice? The question gnawed at her, and for the first time, she wondered if she was being fair, to Daniel or to herself. Her thoughts were interrupted when Daniel walked into the kitchen, a folder in his hand. He hesitated for a moment before sitting down across from her. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice serious. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" He slid the folder across the table. "I've been working with a therapist. I wanted to understand everything that happened between us, to figure out where we went wrong. And I think I've finally realized something." Eleanor opened the folder, her eyes scanning the neatly typed notes. It was a timeline of their relationship, important moments, milestones, and most strikingly, the times when they had grown distant. "I wasn't there for you," Daniel said quietly. "Not the way I should have been. I let the routine of life take over, and I didn't see how unhappy you were. That doesn't excuse what you did, but it helps me understand it." Eleanor felt a lump in her throat. "Daniel, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I just want you to know that I'm trying. For you. For us." For the first time in months, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could make this work after all. Despite their progress, the road to rebuilding their marriage was far from smooth. Trust was a fragile thing, and both Eleanor and Daniel struggled to navigate the uncharted territory of their renewed relationship. One evening, as they were getting ready for bed, Daniel's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He picked it up, his expression unreadable. "Who is it?" Eleanor asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Work email," he said, setting the phone back down. But the hesitation in his voice was enough to spark her suspicions. Eleanor didn't say anything, but later that night, as Daniel slept beside her, she found herself reaching for his phone. Her heart raced as she unlocked it, scrolling through his messages. There was nothing incriminating, no hidden secrets or conversations. And yet, she felt a pang of guilt. What had she expected to find? Why couldn't she let herself trust him? The next morning, Daniel noticed the tension in her demeanor. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing," she said quickly, avoiding his gaze. But he wasn't fooled. "Eleanor, if we're going to make this work, we need to be honest with each other. No more secrets. No more lies." Eleanor took a deep breath, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. I looked through your phone last night. Daniel's expression hardened, but he didn't say anything. I know it was wrong, she continued. But I'm scared, Daniel. I'm scared of losing what we've built. He nodded slowly, his gaze softening. I get it. But if we don't trust each other, we'll never move forward. Can you trust me, Eleanor? She hesitated for a moment before nodding. I'll try. Over time, Eleanor and Daniel began to find their footing. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined their relationship. Instead, they became a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had to lose. Eleanor started seeing a therapist, something she had resisted for years. Through her sessions, she began to unpack the choices she had made, the feelings she had buried, and the person she wanted to become. Daniel, too, continued his own journey of self-reflection. He became more present, more attentive, and more willing to confront the difficult truths of their marriage. Together, they worked to rebuild not just their relationship, but their individual selves. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eleanor reached for Daniel's hand. Thank you, she said softly. For what? He asked. For not giving up on me. On us. He smiled, squeezing her hand gently. We've come a long way, haven't we? We have, she agreed, a small smile tugging at her lips. And I think we're finally where we're meant to be. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Eleanor felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The road had been long and painful, but it had brought them here, to a place of understanding, forgiveness, and most importantly, love.